Spider-Man Homecoming is the most recent Spider-Man film. It's also the latest film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it stars Tom Holland and was directed by John Watts. Now, for those who don't know already, I am a huge Spider-Man fan. I don't have that many Spider-Man comic books, except for this hardcover of a comic book known as the Ultimate Graphic Novels Collection, The Amazing Spider-Man Coming Home. But despite similar titles, this is a completely different story. Although they both have the exact same thing happening in the final scene. So I don't have that many Spider-Man comic books, except for this one, and this one is overall a great story. It's also got fantastic artwork as well. I've also seen quite a few of the animated Spider-Man TV shows. I absolutely love Spectacular Spider-Man. That is by far the best one in my opinion. Excellent TV show. And I own all of the previous 5 movies on DVD. I've got the entire original Sam Raimi trilogy, and I've also got both Amazing Spider-Man films. Because, as you guys can now probably tell, I love Spider-Man. Spider-Man is by far my favorite superhero, and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2 is by far one of my favorite superhero movies. So going into this movie, I was naturally really excited because it's Spider-Man. But I was also rather cautious because there was something about the first trailer that I wasn't too sure about. And I also wasn't too sure about how I felt about Tom Holland as Spider-Man from Captain America Civil War. But a lot of friends who saw the movie were telling me that it's actually a really great film, and it's by far the best Spider-Man movie since 2004 Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2. So some of my YouTube friends personally recommended it to me, and I heard it was really, really good. So, naturally, I went out to see it. So I spent a little bit of time reflecting. I just saw the movie in cinemas the other day, and I love this movie! I went into the movie at least hoping that it would be good. And not only did it meet my expectations, but it by far surpassed them. And I already know that this is by far my new favorite superhero movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Although movies like the original Iron Man or Captain America Civil War, and even the original Avengers, are movies that are not too far behind. The first thing I can say about this movie is the fact it has a much smaller sense of scale than previous MCU films. A lot of previous MCU films like the Avengers usually have it so the entire world, or at the very least the entire country or city, is at stake. Hundreds and hundreds or thousands and thousands or maybe even millions of lives are constantly at stake. The stakes in this movie are definitely lower than previous MCU films, which is honestly a bit of a breath of fresh air. Another thing I really appreciated about this movie is its tone. This movie is much more uplifting than previous MCU films. This movie is just fun. It's a very, very fun, upbeat, delightful superhero film, and it's relentlessly entertaining. I was smiling throughout pretty much this entire film. A lot of other MCU films like Avengers Age of Ultron or Captain America Winter Soldier or Civil War are all superhero movies that are actually really dark and really grim and really serious, and a lot of them have some grit to it. And I definitely think there are some superhero films, not all of them, but some superhero films are taking themselves way too seriously nowadays. I mean, we're watching movies about people dressing up in ridiculous bright and colourful costumes with superpowers going out to save the world from crazy over-the-top villains. It's a really stupid concept when you stop to think about it. So it's a great breath of fresh air to finally see a superhero film that is uplifting, delightful, and overall just a very fun, entertaining superhero film. Another reason why I think this movie works so well is simply Peter Parker / Spider-Man himself. Let's talk about Tom Holland. This is excellent casting. For the longest time, in my opinion, Tobey Maguire has always been the definitive version of Spider-Man. Andrew Garfield was okay, but I grew up with Tobey Maguire, and in my opinion, Tobey Maguire is Spider-Man. And as the trailers for Civil War hit, I was a little bit unsure on how I felt about Tom Holland. And then I actually saw Captain America Civil War, and I was like, okay, I really, really like him as Spider-Man, but as Peter, I'm not sure. I'll have to wait until Spider-Man Homecoming and see him carry his own film before I make a full decision. And after seeing Spider-Man Homecoming, Tom Holland is now my new favourite interpretation of the character. Tom Holland works for this character on so many levels. For starters, one thing I love about Spider-Man as an overall character is that he's one of those superheroes that usually looks after smaller people and people that have more everyday needs. There's a lot of superheroes out there that would really only focus on really big stuff like big major supervillains or big alien invasion, that sort of thing, and so they don't have enough time to really look after everyday things. Captain America and other superheroes like him would probably stop a purse snatching or some other small crime like that if they happen to come across it in the middle of their path. Spider-Man is one of those few superheroes that would take time out of their day to look for purse snatchings or small bank robberies or someone getting mugged in an alley or an elderly needing help to get across the street and other small everyday things like that. This was a little bit illustrated in previous Spider-Man films, but it's really emphasized here, especially in the beginning of the film. But one of my favorite aspects of this character is the fact they really emphasize that he is just a kid. I mean, characters keep on saying that Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield were just kids, and I know they were in high school and everything, but looking at that age, I never bought that they were the age that they were supposed to be. With Tom Holland, however, I actually bought that he was only about 15 years old. And this is coming from someone who is about Peter Parker's age. I'm currently 16, I'm about to turn 17, and so as someone who is Peter's age, I bought that he was just a teenager. And it wasn't just the fact that he was in high school and people kept on telling him that he was just a kid or he was just a teenager, but they also show and emphasize on it. I think a lot of it comes down to the nature of Tom Holland's appearance and voice. He also acts like a teenager. He's flawed and he's very naive and he looks at people very black and white. You're either a good person or a bad person and there's no in between. Another great illustration is a certain thing that happens to Peter towards the end of the movie, during the climax of the movie. It's during the climax at Peter's absolute lowest point. I'm trying to describe the scene, so if you've seen the movie you know what I'm talking about without giving it away for spoiler reasons. But essentially during the breaking point and at Peter's lowest moment in the film, during the climax of the film, Tom Holland absolutely killed it in the scene. Not only was it very emotional, but I really did buy that he was just a teenager, and I felt like that if I was in his situation, I'd probably be reacting the exact same way. Because the way he reacted to the situation is a way I would not expect someone like Andrew Garfield or Tobey Maguire's version of Spider-Man to react. And as a result, that's one of my favourite scenes in the movie. And since I actually bought Peter Parker's age, I could actually relate to this character more than I could relate to Tobey Maguire or Andrew Garfield. But outside of that, I also feel like that Tom Holland really nailed the role. In my opinion, I think he's excellent as both Peter Parker and Spider-Man. He's great as Peter Parker because he's geeky and socially awkward, but he's also highly educated and very smart, and overall likable and relatable, but you can see why he gets bullied. And when he's in the suit, you still get the same vibe and feeling that he really is just a teenager, but he also has the cocky smart aleck, and in the suit he gives lots of quips and jokes, but he knows when to shut up and take things seriously. And speaking of jokes, that leads to another thing I love about this movie. This is by far the funniest Spider-Man movie we've had so far. The thing I love about this movie is the fact that the humor came from a variety of different things. Some of the humor comes down from things that Peter says as Spider-Man, like some of the jokes and quips he makes, but a lot of the humor also comes down to funny, witty dialogue with other people, or just simply the situations that Peter gets into, both as Peter Parker and as Spider-Man. Or the witty banter between Peter or Spider-Man and other characters. It's overall just a really funny movie. Again, I'm gonna try hard not to spoil anything, but there's a character in this movie named Karen, and she was hysterical. And in my opinion, I think she was responsible for a really large portion of the laughs I got out of this movie. I absolutely loved Karen in this movie, and if you've seen the movie, hopefully you know exactly what character I'm talking about. At first I was a little bit unsure about it because Karen felt very similar to another character in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. However, I don't really mind because I just thought she was a really funny character. Moving on, there are other characters I also really liked. Ned, for example. Now, I don't know if this is an original character or if he's from previous comic books or anything, but I didn't know who Ned was going in. And honestly, I think he's the best version of a best friend that Peter Parker's had in any of the previous Spider-Man films. This is the first time in a Spider-Man movie where I really truly bought the fact that these two had a really great bond and a really great friendship. You can tell they've been friends for a very long time, and I actually buy the fact that they're friends, which is something I never really bought with either between Tobey Maguire and James Franco, or with Andrew Garfield and Dane DeHaan from the previous films. This is something I think even the Raimi films kind of got a bit wrong, because even in the first film, I never really got that Peter and Harry were really great friends. They said that they were best friends, but they bickered for pretty much the entire movie, and their relationship only got worse as the films go on. So I never ever got the feeling that they were really great friends. And the same applies for The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Here, I absolutely get it. I instantly buy the fact that they're friends, and again, the banter between each other is definitely some of the funniest scenes in the movie. I also loved how much Ned contributed to the plot. He's in pretty much the entire movie, and he helps Peter Parker out throughout pretty much the entire film, and I absolutely love the scenes with him in. And overall, he's just a great, very funny, likable guy. I love Ned. There's also a subplot between Peter Parker and Liz Allen, the love interest in this movie, and I do think that this is by far the weakest aspect of this film. But even then, I still found the romance at least somewhat interesting. They kind of have a crush for each other, but they're a bit socially awkward to each other because it's high school. I think she's better than Mary Jane from the Sam Raimi trilogy, but I do think that Gwen Stacy is better from the Mark Webb trilogy, so I'd rank her right in the middle. And then there's the villain, played by Michael Keaton. Excellent character. I love this guy. Not only do I think he's the best villain in the MCU, but I also think that he is one of the best villains on the big screen in a Spider-Man movie. In my opinion, his only competition is Alfred Molina from Spider-Man 2. And the reason why I think the Vulture was such a great villain in this movie is the same reason why Dr. Octopus was such a great villain in Spider-Man 2. Besides, Michael Keaton gave an excellent performance, and he really brought this character to life in a way that was memorable, and he really stands out, and is a very memorable villain. Also, I think the design of his outfit is pretty cool. Not only that, but this is a character with depth, and he's got such an understandable motivation. There's something revealed about his character that totally caught me off guard, but I think was an excellent way of adding depth to his character, and he also had a great motivation. I knew exactly where he was coming from and why he was doing the things that he was doing. I loved the villain in this movie, and it's also great saying that because I'm not a huge fan of the Vulture. I mean, he's okay, but if someone asked me what are some of my favorite Spider-Man villains, the Vulture is definitely not one of the first villains that would come to mind. I just didn't really care for Vulture as a character, but I think the Vulture in Spider-Man Homecoming is an excellent villain. One of the best in all 6 of these films. Another character I want to point out is Tony Stark. Now, this is something I was really worried about going in. I was getting all excited that this is a Spider-Man movie, and yes, Spider-Man, and I'm happy to see Spider-Man, and I'm excited to see Spider-Man, but why is Iron Man taking up so much of these trailers? At first, I really didn't get why Tony Stark had to be in this movie, and the fact he was all over the trailers made me really concerned that he was going to overcrowd and overshadow the film, and it's going to feel more like an Iron Man movie than a Spider-Man movie, because I went to the movie to see Spider-Man, and I am relieved to say that Tony Stark is barely in this movie. The Joker from Suicide Squad got more screen time than Tony Stark does in this movie. He's only in about 3 or 4 scenes, none of them are very long, and in a way, I can kind of see why he's there. Peter Parker has grown up loving Tony Stark / Iron Man, looking up at him and always wanting to be like him when he grew up. And Tony Stark sort of operates like a driving force for the film. And a lot of the struggles and a lot of the motivations and a lot of things that drives Peter Parker as a character throughout this movie is driven by Tony Stark. So I think if Tony Stark was completely removed from the movie, I think it would have a negative effect on the plot. So I think to an extent, I think Tony needed to be in the movie, but I am really relieved to say that he's only in the movie for about 10 minutes max. And this movie looks fantastic. It's got gorgeous cinematography, and the CGI is absolutely seamless. And throughout the entire time, there was not a single shot in this movie where I could tell the difference between CGI and real life. That's how good it is. And I also really loved the action in this movie. For the most part. Why? For very similar reasons to why I loved the train fight scene in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2. The thing I love about the action in this film is the fact that every single action scene in one way or another takes serious advantage of Spider-Man's powers. The way he utilizes his webbing or the way he utilizes wall crawling really allowed the filmmakers to get very creative with the action scenes in ways that I would not be able to see in any other superhero film. This is what I think makes some of the best Spider-Man action scenes. I love seeing how creative you can get with action sequences when you utilize Spider-Man's powers in a very creative way. And the creativity of the utilization of his powers, among other things, made a lot of the action scenes thoroughly entertaining. But if there was anything I do have to criticize, it's the fact that I think that some of the action scenes, especially some of the ones towards the end, like the climax and the scene with the boat that was in the trailers, I honestly don't think that scene was intense or had as much of a sense of urgency to it as it was trying to have. I could tell that the scene was trying to be intense and it was trying to have a sense of urgency, and it just needed to be a little bit more intense because I was definitely invested in the scene, but I wasn't gripping my seat. It was incredibly entertaining, but I don't think it was as intense as it was trying to be. I think just a little bit more intensity would have made those last few action scenes stand out a little bit better. But the ones at the very beginning of the film, I absolutely loved. I also loved how there's a certain little action scene that plays around with the idea of how does he fight crime when he's in an area when there aren't any skyscrapers to swing across. That scene was hilarious. I absolutely loved that scene. The score by Michael Giacchino is also fantastic. Wow, Michael Giacchino is absolutely killing it this decade with movie scores. I mean, he's done scores for Pixar movies, Mission Impossible, Star Wars, and now Spider-Man. That's just to name a few. Yeah, that's why Michael Giacchino is my favorite score composer. Also, if you haven't seen this movie yet and you're going to see this movie, do not get up right when the credits start, because there's both a mid-credit scene and a post-credit scene, and I loved both of them. The mid-credit scene was good because it had relevance for plot reasons, but for the end-credit scene, I'm not going to give away what happens or what it is, but it was hysterical. What added to the humor is the fact that I was literally the only person in my entire theater that sat through the credits. So I'm in the theater, the credits start, and everyone else around me, there were like 3 families with me in the theater. It was relatively empty, but everybody else got up and immediately left the theater right when the credits started. And I was the only person who sat down and stayed and sat through the entire credit sequence. And what they did with the end credit scene, plus the fact I was literally the only person in the theater when it happened, and it was hysterical. It was so worth it. I loved the end credit scene. I won't dare spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it. Some people were peed off about it, and I can sort of see why, but I thought it was hilarious. I think it's definitely really high in the list of my favorite cinema moments I've had this year. This is actually the first movie this year where I've actually struggled to find flaws I have with the film. Okay, yes, there are a couple of flaws after seriously thinking about it, but every single flaw I could think of at least some way has some sort of counter-argument. For starters, there's a certain twist about one particular character that I actually missed in the theater. I probably was paying attention to something else, and I didn't pick it up until I started watching spoiler reviews after I saw the film for myself, and went, oh wow, I didn't notice that. I'm not too sure how I feel about that. Also, Flash Thompson. Flash Thompson is your typical school bully, and while he definitely was a bully, I definitely think he should have been a character that should have been a bit more hateable. I really think he should have felt like a Draco Malfoy. Maybe not to that extent, but I wish that he was one of those characters that you just love to hate. The pacing can be a little bit off a little bit because of how well it nails both Peter Parker's high school life and his responsibilities as Spider-Man, but I think every single Spider-Man movie has at least a little bit of trouble with the pacing. Yes, even Spider-Man 2. The romance subplot, like I said, is one of the weakest aspects of the film, and the fact that this movie takes place exactly 8 years after the events of the Avengers, when you start to think about other things said in other MCU films, you start to realize that it kind of really messes with the timeline, and it's hard to wrap your head around what movie takes place in what year. It's not as bad as Terminator Genesis, but it does play around with your head a little bit, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. But apart from that, I absolutely loved this movie. This is now one of my new personal favorite superhero movies, definitely one of my favorite Spider-Man movies, and I'm definitely excited to the idea of hopefully getting this movie on Blu-ray. I thought long and hard about this, but Spider-Man Homecoming gets an A+. Stay tuned until my next review, whatever it may be, but until then, yippee-ki-yay, movie lovers!